Okay, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. In this video, we're going to look at the phase of the preservation and the collection of the Quran during the Caliphate of Abu Bakr, the first Khalif of Islam. Now, the copies of the Quran that were prepared during the time of the Prophet, peace be upon him, as we mentioned in the previous video, were collected on different kinds of materials. Some of them were collected on leather, some of them were collected on leaves of trees, some were on bones, and so the entire copy of the Quran, if you like, was in the hands of a very few people. But that's not a problem, because of course we've mentioned that the main way of preservation of the Quran was through memory. Just like today, millions of Muslims have memorized the Quran, including myself. In the Prophet's time, the companions had all memorized, or majority of them had memorized the Quran as well. So that was the main method, as we mentioned before, of the preservation of the sacred text of the Quran as well. Now, some companions, of course, would have had on their parchments maybe one surah or a couple. Some would have had a few verses with them. But very few would have actually had the entire Quran written with them as well. So under the Caliphate of Abu Bakr, it was deemed necessary that the scattered portions of the Quran with various companions be gathered into one place and collected and preserved. And this responsibility primarily fell on the shoulders of one of the scribes of the Prophet, whose name is very famous, Zayd ibn Thabit. And so he was one of the scribes of the Prophet, and he mentions himself that Abu Bakr sent for me at a time when the Yamama battles had witnessed the martyrdom of numerous companions of the Prophet. And he said, I got to his house and I found Umar ibn Khattab with him. And so Abu Bakr began, he said, Umar has just come to me and said, in the Yamama battles, death has dealt most severely with the Quran, the people who are memorizing and people who know the Quran. And I fear it will deal with them with equal severity in other theaters of war. So there was this concern that many of the companions who had indeed memorized the Quran were being killed, right? And so the Quran will be gone. Yazhabul Quran. Quran will go away. So I'm of the opinion that you should command the Quran be collected. And then Abu Bakr continues saying to him that I said to Umar, how can we embark on what the Prophet never did? So Abu Bakr is telling Umar that, this idea you've come with of keeping the Quran, preserving the Quran through this way, the Prophet never did this, right? And Umar said, look, it was a good deed, nevertheless. And he kept on repeating this to me. Umar kept saying this to me, it's a good deed. We had this conversation, and it convinced me of this undertaking. And I agreed, Abu Bakr agreed with Umar, right? And he said, Zayd, look, you're young and intelligent. You used to record the revelations for the Prophet, peace be upon him, and we know nothing that would cause us concern about your character. So pursue the Quran and collect it together. And Zayd himself says that had they asked me to move a mountain, it could not have been weightier than what they requested me to do now. So I asked him how they could undertake what the Prophet had never done, just like Abu Bakr said to Umar. And Abu Bakr and Umar then turned to me and insisted that it was permissible and good, and they did not cease replying to my concerns until Allah placed it in my heart that this was the way Allah had willed, just like Umar and Abu Bakr had willed for it to be done so. So they'd approach Zayd ibn Thabit, who had a number of credentials, had a number of things that made him the ideal candidate to undertake this very, very important task of preserving and collecting the Quran. He was in his early 20s at the time, and he'd been privileged enough to live in the Prophet's neighborhood and serve as one of his most visible scribes. He was also amongst the Hufaz, and the breadth of his credentials made him an outstanding candidate for his task. And Abu Bakr also, in other places, including the one that we just mentioned, listed some of the qualifications that made him the ideal candidate. Number one was he was young, which signifies a sense of vitality and energy, because you need someone with a lot of energy to do this task. And number two was his irreproachable morals. He was of exemplary conduct. And when Abu Bakr said to him that we've never accused you of any wrongdoing. Number three was his intelligence. He was very sharp. He had the competence. He had the awareness. Number four was his prior experience with recording revelation, right? He was, in fact, this would be a fifth point, that he was one of the fortunate few who attended the Archangel Gabriel's recitation with the Prophet during the month of Ramadan as well. So the Prophet was receiving revelation and reciting the Quran with Jibreel, peace be upon him, and Zayd, one of the scribes of the Prophet, would be there, was present at that moment in time as well. So this was one of the things that really made Zayd ibn Thabit become a pivotal figure alongside Abu Bakr, Umar, in terms of protecting and preserving the sacred text of the Quran. And so Abu Bakr then issued a general invitation or a decree for everyone to participate in this endeavor, right? So it was a public proclamation, a public invite, and the project was carried out in the sacred precinct of the Prophet's mosque. That was a gathering place. And following his instructions, Umar used to stand at the gates of the mosque and he would announce that anyone who has written verses dictated from the Prophet must bring them. I'll explain the method in a second. And Bilal would do the same thing. He would walk around the streets of Medina and he would announce that anyone who has written copies of the Quran should bring it to Zayd ibn Thabit, who is in the Prophet's mosque as well. So Zayd ibn Thabit was himself someone who had memorized the Quran, and so he could have written the entire Quran down from his entire memory, right? Because he knew the Quran by heart, right? In addition to that, there were hundreds of companions who had memorized the Quran, and they could have written down this entire Quran by just saying, look, a group of you get together and together you write down what you memorize, right? And there were also copies of the Quran which existed at the time of the Prophet, peace be upon him, right? And he could have used that, Zayd could have used that to make his copy of the Quran. But he did not limit himself to these methods only. These were very strong methods, but he was more expansive in the methods that he used in terms of preserving the Quran. So he used all of these methods, his memory, the memory of the companions, the collections of the Quran that the companions had as well. But he did not include any verse, in fact, in his transcription, in his gathering, in his project, unless he had received written and oral testimonies proving its uninterrupted succession from the Prophet. Like it had to be, you had to prove that you'd had heard it, and the Prophet had verified that you received it from the Prophet as well. And obviously many of the companions had copies that had been preserved and verified by the Prophet, peace be upon himself as well. So he gathered all of them and made a new copy of them, of that, Zayd ibn Thabit as well. So there were four main methods, which I'm going to just very briefly, ever so briefly outline, that were in addition to what I mentioned before. The first method was, in effect, the memory of Zayd ibn Thabit, which would have been sufficient on his own memory. Number two was, whenever somebody would come to Zayd in the Prophet's mosque with a verse, he would receive it with Umar. So Umar was also appointed by Abu Bakr to be with Zayd as well, and they would receive it jointly. They would receive the verse from the companion jointly, and he would verify it from his own memory as well. So two memories verifying this written document. Again, they're relying on memory. The third method, which is important, was no written verse. So any written verse that was brought to them was not accepted until two reliable witnesses had testified that it was written in the presence of the Prophet and that they were presented before the Prophet, and he affirmed that these verses were in accordance with the 7 letters of which the Quran was revealed. So this was a very important method, this third method as well. Like you had to bring witnesses, right? And so several traditions mention this as well. So this was a third method. The fourth method after all of this was that these written verses were collated with the collections that different companions had prepared for themselves. So they had their own collections of the Quran as well. And according to Imam Abu Shama, the purpose of this fourth method was that they wanted to take the utmost care in the transcription of the Quran and not just rely solely on memory. So there was 2 really overarching methods that were important in this whole project as well, and that it should be transcribed exactly from the verses that were written in the presence of the Prophet, peace be upon him, as well. And so this was a functional methodology behind the collection of the Quran during the time of Abu Bakr, may Allah be pleased with him. And it becomes easy to understand one small issue, it's not a major issue, which was that there are 2 verses at the end of Surah At-Tawbah, Surah Bara'ah or Surah Tawbah, which is chapter number 9 of the Quran, verse 129, verse 128 and 129, these 2 verses. It begins, لَقَدْ جَاءَكُمْ رَسُولٌ مِّنْ أَنفُسِكُمْ عَزِيزٌ عَلَيْهِ مَا عَنِتُّمْ حَرِيصٌ عَلَيْكُمْ بِالْمُؤْمِنِينَ رَءُوفٌ رَحِيمٌ فَإِن تَوَلَّوْا فَقُلْ حَسْبِيَ اللَّهُ لَا إِلَهَ إِلَّا هُوَ عَلَيْهِ تَوَكَّلْتُ وَهُوَ رَبُّ الْعَرْشِ الْعَظِيمِ. And so this verse was known by all the companions to be part of the Quran. Everybody had memorized it. Everybody had known that this was part of the Quran. But in terms of the written copy of it, it was with only one companion, Abu Khuzaymah, may Allah be pleased with him. So they weren't found with anybody else except him. Remember what I said about the third part, you need 2 witnesses that can testify that it was written in the presence of the Prophet, peace be upon him, right? And he hadn't said anything to the contrary. So this obviously means that nobody besides Abu Khuzaymah memorized these verses. Everybody knew this was from the Quran. But remember the stringent method that Zayd ibn Thabit had set himself up for, right? This does not mean that nobody else had them in writing or anyone other than him did not know of their being part of the Quran, right? But what it means is, with the exception of Abu Khuzaymah, these verses were not found with anyone of those who were coming with different written verses as they were dictated by the Prophet, peace be upon him, right? Otherwise, it's a fact that this was part of the Quran, right? Everybody knew this was part of the Quran. So it's just a methodological point that to be aware of as well. So this has been received by the Prophet. There were hundreds of companions who knew that these 2 verses were from the Quran. And the scholars talk about, they're not theological points that are being made in the Quran anyway. But the point is that this was known to be part of the Quran anyway. So this was something that was a point just to mention as a sort of footnote, if you like, in the whole discussion as well. Zayd ibn Thabit was extremely meticulous. He was one of the many scribes of the Prophet, but he was the one who was seen to be the most reliable and decided to take on this task as well. And so the Quranic verses were arranged with the order that was fixed by the Prophet, peace be upon him, not according to verses at this initial stage, but according to not according to surahs, chapters, but according to verses rather. So they were collected according to the verses in order, and the surah, the chapters were kept separate at this moment in time as well. There were other discussions to be had around the type of script, which I won't go into because it's beyond the discussion of what I want to have with you today. And so there was an organized document, right, which had the collective endorsement of the entire ummah, and reference could be made to it when it was required as well, right? And the transcript, which was written under the order of Abu Bakr, was kept with him during his lifetime, and then they were given or remained with Umar, peace be upon him, and on his martyrdom, when he was martyred, they were passed to the custody of Hafsa, may Allah be pleased with her, in accordance with his instructions. Umar said, give it to Hafsa. And then the discussion continues around how it reached Uthman later on as well, which I won't go into. I want to just briefly talk about Umar, because Umar played an important role in the spread of the Quran. So Abu Bakr played an important role in the collection of the Quran, but in terms of spreading the Quran, which was collected in the Caliphate of Abu Bakr rather, Umar played an important role in the spread of the Quran. And so he was appointed as the Khalif by Abu Bakr on his deathbed, and he was given the Suhuf, this collection of the Quran. Now, aside from many of the successful victories on the battlefield, Umar's reign was marked by the Quran's rapid spread beyond the confines of the Arabian Peninsula. He dispatched, for example, at least 10 companions to Basra for the purpose of teaching the Quran. For example, he sent Ibn Mas'ud to Kufa. Someone once came to Umar, for example, and he said there's a person in Kufa who dictates the Quran by heart. So Umar became a little bit angry at this, but when he found out that it was Ibn Mas'ud and he recalled his competence and abilities, he calmed down and was somewhat regained his composure. And there's significant information also exists about the Quran and its spread in Syria. Yazid bin Abu Sufyan, who was Syria's governor, had complained to Umar about the masses of Muslims requiring Quran education in Islamic matters, and he urgently requested him for teachers. And so he chose 3 companions, Mu'adh, Ubadah and Abu Darda, who Umar instructed them to proceed to Hims, where after they achieved their objectives, one of them would journey on to Damascus, another to Palestine. And when these 3 scholars were satisfied with its work in Hims, Abu Darda continued on to Damascus, and Mu'adh even went on to Palestine, leaving Ubadah behind. Right? Mu'adh died soon afterwards, but Abu Darda lived in Damascus for a long time. In fact, he established a highly reputable scholarly circle, and students who were under his tutelage were above 1,600 students, 1,600 students, right? And then his pupils were divided into groups of 10, and he assigned a separate instructor for each and made his round to check on their progress, right? And people who pass this elementary level, they came under his direct instruction, right? And so the advanced students, amazingly, had the double privilege of studying with Abu Darda and also functioning as intermediary teachers. This is something worth reading. You'll find this in Siyar of Abu al-Zahabi. They mentioned there as well. And this was mentioned many places. Abu Ash'ari, for example, another companion, separated his students into groups within the Basra Masjid, and he supervised nearly 300. Right, this was very early on during the Caliphate of Umar. In the capital, Umar sent Yazid bin Abdullah, for example, to teach the Quran to the outlying Bedouins. Abu Sufyan was an inspector, and he used to proceed to tribes and discover to the extent to which they had learned the Quran as well. Right? In Medina, he appointed 3 companions who would get a salary, and they would be also teaching like verses of Quran to people as well. Sadly, Umar was stabbed by Abu Lu'lu, who was a Christian slave from Persia, towards the end of the 23rd year Hijri. And so we'll talk about the next stage in the next video. I hope that's been useful. As always, I always look forward to your comments and contributions. Stay safe. Until then, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.